Hello everyone. Today we will be discussing the question, do video games cause real violence? I'm Landon and welcome to Landocast. So let's get on to our first press release discussing our topic, which is from APA.org. In a quote from the release, it states, "There is insufficient scientific evidence to support a causal link between violent video games and violent behavior, according to an updated resolution adopted by the American Psychological Association." So this shows that there is little evidence between violence and violent video games. APA's Governing Council of Representatives seated a task force to review its August 2015 resolution in light of many occasions in which members of the media or policymakers have cited that resolution as evidence that violent video games are the cause of violent behavior, including mass shootings. Violence is a complex social problem that likely stems from many factors that warrant attention from researchers, policymakers, and the public, said APA President Sandra L. Schulman, PhD. Attributing violence to video gaming is not scientifically sound and draws attention away from other factors such as a history of violence, which we know from the research is a major predictor of future violence. So the quote from APA President shows that saying something like the only reason this school shooting happened was because of violent video games is unscientific, as there are a multitude of factors that can cause tragic events like shootings. So it's good that she pointed this out. APA has worked for years to discuss the effects of video games and other media on children while encouraging the industry to design video games with adequate parental controls. It is also pushed to refine the video game rating system to reflect the levels and characteristics of violence in these games. This quote from the release displays that the rating system has been refined throughout the years and that the APA has encouraged games to have adequate parental controls. Okay, so that's the rundown of the release from APA. Now, I would like to introduce the first ever guest on the podcast, my father.
Hello.
All right, so let's look at this other article from elifesciences.org.
Neuroimaging and behavioral evidence that violent video games exert no negative effect on human empathy for pain and emotional reactivity to violence.
All right, so we're on the abstract now. Influential accounts claim that violent video games decrease players' emotional empathy by desensitizing them to both virtual and real-life violence. However, scientific evidence for this claim is inconclusive and controversially debated. To assess the causal effect of VBGs on the behavioral and neural correlates of empathy and emotional reactivity to violence, we conducted a prospective experimental study using functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI. We recruited 89 male participants without prior VBG experience. Over the course of 2 weeks, participants played either a highly violent video game or a non-violent version of the same game. Before and after this period, participants completed an fMRI experiment with paradigms measuring their empathy from pain and emotional reactivity to violent images. Applying a Bayesian analysis approach throughout enabled us to find substantial evidence for the absence of an effect of VBGs on the behavioral and neural correlates of empathy. Moreover, participants in the VBG group were not desensitized to images of real-world violence. These results imply that short and controlled exposure to VBGs does not numb empathy nor the responses to real-world violence. We discussed the implications of our findings regarding the potential and limitations of experimental research on the causal effect of VBGs. While VBGs might not have a discernible effect on the investigated subpopulation within our carefully controlled experimental setting, our results cannot preclude that effects could be found in settings with higher ecological validity, in vulnerable subpopulations, or after more extensive VBG play. I think that what they're basically saying is, with people only playing it for a select amount of time, a person's empathy to real-world violence does not decrease.
If you look at the closer there, it says our results cannot preclude that effects could be found in settings with higher ecological validity in vulnerable subpopulations or after more extensive VVG play. How long did they play?
Okay, let's see that.
It's at 89 participants with prior VVG experience.
It says over the course of 2 weeks, participants of the violent game group
2 weeks.
repeatedly played a VVG, while the control game group played a non-violent version of the same game. Subsequently, both groups completed the post-test fMRI session. Here, participants performed the empathy for pain paradigm again and also completed a task designed to measure emotional reactivity to violent pictures. So over the course of 2 weeks, this happened. This occurred. So they are right about this not being able to measure the effects of violent video games over very long courses of time, like multiple, like 1 or 2 years. It'd be kind of hard to have people coming in to play a video game for 1 to 2 years straight. So it does look like what?
Electrical stimuli were produced by a Digitimer DS5 stimulator on the dorsum of the left hand. Subjective pain thresholds were determined using a standardized calibration procedure. Participant received short, 500 millisecond stimuli of increasing intensity and was asked to rate pain intensity on a numeric scale. So they made these folks feel pain. They're getting a shock for when? When are they getting a shock? To facilitate empathic responses during the experimental tasks, participants completed the experimental session together with a male Confederate. The Confederate acted as if he were a second participant of the experiment. This deception was maintained until the end of the last experimental session, at which point participants were debriefed.
Okay, so
this is pretty extensive.
Yeah.
This is a really extensive study.
Well, what it's saying right there is so it looks like it's saying how they went about this was they tested people's empathy for theirs and others' pain. We used a well-established paradigm to measure participants' empathetic responses. Empathic responses. Participants either received electrical stimuli themselves, electric stimuli themselves, self-condition, or saw images of the Confederate indicating that he was currently receiving electric stimulation. Other condition. Stimuli were either painful, pain condition, or perceptible but not painful, known pain condition. The timeline of the task is illustrated in Figure 1A. At the start of each trial, a downwards or rightwards arrow presented for 2 seconds indicated whether the next stimulus would be delivered to the participant or the Confederate, respectively. Cue phase. Red and blue arrows indicated painful and non-painful stimulation, respectively. Sorry. Edit that out. After a jittered interval, 37 seconds, the stimulus was delivered, stimulation phase. In the self-condition, the participant received the electrical stimulus, 0.5 seconds, and saw a pixelated photograph, 1 second. In the other condition, the participant saw a photograph of the Confederate with a neutral or painful facial expression. After half of the trials, participants rated the last stimulus on a 100-step visual analog scale, VAS. In the self-condition, participants rated how painful the last stimulus was for themselves. In the other condition, participants rated how painful the stimulus was for the Confederate or other-oriented painfulness rating, and how unpleasant it was for themselves to observe the Confederate receiving the stimulus, self-oriented unpleasantness rating. In total, there were 64 trials with 16 trials per condition: self-pain, self-no pain, other no pain. Conditions were presented to a pseudo-randomized order. The task was presented using Cogent, implemented in MATLAB 2017B. The total task was approximately 20 minutes. Task duration was 20 minutes. That's not results, that's discussion.
Our findings contrast with several earlier studies that found a negative relationship between playing VVGs and empathic responses to violence. Importantly, the majority of these studies were quasi-experimental in nature and therefore provide only limited evidence for a putative causal effect of violent gaming.
Moreover, the few experimental studies that exist implemented designs investigating short-term carryover effects as they had exposed participants to virtual violence rather than immediately before measurements of outcome variables of interest. This approach yields consistent evidence from both behavioral and neural data that VVGs, to the extent and characteristics played in our interventional design, are not causally responsible for a persistent lack of empathy or emotional desensitization to violence.
This approach yields consistent evidence from both behavioral and neural data that VVGs, to the extent and characteristics played in our interventional design, are not causally responsible for a persistent lack of empathy or emotional desensitization to violence.
So
Does that say it all?
hold on.
Does that do you agree with that?
Yes. That further helps our point that but violent video games don't cause violence, or that further helps their point that violent video games don't cause real world violence, or they also don't drain their empathy.
Look at this. Our experimental design ensured that participants of the experimental group were exposed to a substantial amount of violent gameplay during gaming sessions. Each participant killed an average of 2,845 other characters in a graphically violent way. The overall exposure to virtual violence was still very low when compared to the amount that is possible in the everyday life of typical VVG players. Participants played for 7 hours over the course of 2 weeks. Habitual gamers can play an average of 16 hours in the same time frame. In particular, adolescents and children, as well as persons with specific neuropsychiatric traits, might be especially susceptible to long-term changes due to increased brain plasticity. However, empirically tested higher levels of violence with the same degree of control as realized in our study would reach the limits of practical feasibility. We thus believe that our results provide an important perspective on the size of VVG effects that could realistically be expected in experimental research.
That goes with what I said earlier. Of it would be hard to monitor people across 1 to 2 years, to show those effects.
Not if you had an AI camera connected to the console.
Well, we don't have that type of technology yet, probably.
It is possible that due to this strict pre-selection criterion, our sample was drawn from a subpopulation particularly resistant to desensitization. This is a very interesting study. Let's look at the editor's evaluation.
Lengersdorf and colleagues present behavioral and fMRI data that are valuable in demonstrating no impact of violent video games on the emotional response to pain in their particular sample. The effects may be specific to the participant group who have no neurological disorder and no character traits that would predispose to desensitization because they are selected due to little prior experience playing these games. There are some openly discussed test-retest reliability issues, session 1 through 2, with the fMRI measures, but they present convincing evidence for the absence of effect in this group.
The effects may be specific to the participant group who have no neurological disorder and no character traits that would predispose to desensitization because they are selected due to little prior experience playing these games. So do you think that someone could be numbed almost like in a PTSD kind of way by playing video games? In some small way?
In some small way. You're never actually killing a human in these games, Yeah, you're shooting pixels on a screen. Saying that a game, it's game's fault for making somebody want to do something terrible is inaccurate, I think, because
I think maybe you're biased.
There's always everybody's biased. in their own way.
Take someone who doesn't play video games and compare them to you that does play video games. Which person do you think is more prone to be violent when violence is called for or not called for? Have a violent reaction to something that should be a peaceful reaction.
Well, look, one of the main things. Well, first of all, it would heavily depend on who the person is. It could be a war veteran that absolutely loved violence, though that would probably be unlikely. It could also be.
I feel like a war veteran would be less prone to violence because they know the cost.
Yeah, that's why I said that's why I said it would be unlikely.
I'd like to see a study where a veteran should say a group of veterans, 100 veterans play video games to see the reaction.
Well,
we're at 26 minutes.
Well, so I think that from my point of view, I don't think that I do play video games, but really just depends on the person. Do you know me to be a very violent person?
No.
And from all the games that I've played, usually the best endings are the ones where you kill the least people, or the ones where you speak your way out of situations rather than kill your way out of situations. So
I think as long as the video game player knows that they can't behave that way in the real world.
Exactly. Yes, I completely 100% agree. Like, that's why we shouldn't let 6-year-olds play Grand Theft Auto.
Yeah, or anyone under 18 shouldn't be allowed to play video games.
I wouldn't say that we should go that far.
Well, you're entitled to your opinion. That's like your opinion, man.
Yeah.
You have your opinion, I have mine. No video games under 21. Not allowed to play video games unless you have served in the military.
All right. Well, I think that the most reasonable conclusion is that games are not associated with a decrease in empathy or an increase in violence, but it seems like
it is possible that it could result in a violent action if somebody plays violent video games all the time.
In conclusion, it seems that the video games don't have any sort of causal link. So it seems that violent video games aren't associated with, well, at least over short periods of time, a decrease in empathy, and also they aren't really associated. Violent video games aren't associated with actual real world violence. Okay, so it seems that the evidence supports our conclusion. And all right, everybody, thank you for listening. I hope you have a nice day.